On the night of April 14th, 1959, a fine rain pressed against the tin roof of the rented house on Hunter Street like patient fingers, and Atlanta seemed to hold its breath along with the Carter family. The brown envelope had already been opened on the table, beside an overflowing ashtray and a mug of coffee that had lost its heat long ago. Inside, the bank's letter was not long, but it carried the kind of sentence that decides the size of a life. If the financing approval came through, the move to a newly opened neighborhood in DeKalb County would stop being a whispered conversation and become a date on the calendar. If it came through, certain visits would also become inevitable. Visits that had already begun even before there was a key in hand. Men knocking on the door by mistake, women asking whose house it was with the same naturalness one uses to ask whose body it is. What was at stake was not only an address. It was the chance to raise the children without the rent rising every year, without the landlord coming into the yard to check the fence, without the overcrowded school 2 streets away and the bus passing by too full to stop. And it was at the same time the awareness that the new neighborhood, straight streets, fresh curbs, the smell of cut lumber, came with unwritten rules that did not need to appear on paper to wound, in a time when deeds, mortgages, and neighborhood standards worked as instruments as effective as any sign. Samuel Carter, 36 years old, had worked for 9 years as a porter and maintenance helper at Terminal Station near Spring Street, where the noise of trains marked the hours and the movement of passengers and freight followed fixed schedules, whistles, and announcements. His dark blue uniform always had a crease across the chest because Lillian, his wife, ironed it even when the lights failed and the heat inside the house rose, with limited ventilation and April's heavy air trapped between narrow walls. Lillian was 34 and sewed for others, taking hems and alterations that ladies left at the display window of a shop on Auburn Avenue, sometimes paying in cash, sometimes in promises, in a circuit of domestic, informal work in which thread, needle, fabric, and time became a few dollars and tolerated delays. They had 2 children, Ruth, 12, who had already learned to stay quiet when the world demanded silence, and Ben, 8, who ran as if his body had not yet learned the limits the city taught. The rented house was narrow, with windows that stuck, but the yard had a peach tree that, in summer, bore small, sweet fruit. That was where Lillian hung the sheets, and that was where Samuel, on rare days, sat to repair a chair with glue and patience, dealing with what already tired and reused nails, as if each repair pushed an expense farther down the road. News of a new neighborhood had arrived at the end of March, brought by a co-worker from the terminal who spoke softly in the corridors. A subdivision near Panthersville, south of Decatur, with light brick houses and lawns still without shade. They said the developer, squeezed by slow sales, would negotiate with black buyers as long as the paperwork was discreet and fast. They said some families had already managed to close contracts. They also said the Homeowners Association was forming even before the last house received paint, as was common in recent subdivisions, where improvements and protecting values were treated as part of the development itself. Association was a clean word for something that could be dirty. In Atlanta, clean words often hid the part that cut, and a language of neighborhood character circulated easily in letters, notes, and meetings, as if it were merely administration when, in practice, it was control. On Saturday, April 4th, 1959, Samuel and Lillian went to see the houses. They took Moreland Avenue early, under an open sky after a week of wind, and headed toward the county. As they went, the streets seemed to widen, the utility poles to spread out, and the smell of the city gave way to the smell of damp earth and new asphalt, with stretches still under construction and fresh ditches along the road. The subdivision had a hand-painted sign with white letters announcing Cedar Grove Estates, although the cedars were still saplings tied to stakes. The houses all looked related. Low roof lines, small garages, windows too large for cheap curtains. A white realtor in a light shirt and a loosened tie appeared with a folder and a smile that did not reach his eyes. His name was Mr. Henley, and he spoke like someone who was running late, as if every minute there needed to be finished before it became a problem. He showed them the living room, the hallway, the bathroom with gleaming tile, new fixtures, and the smell of fresh paint. Ruth ran her fingers along the wall and felt the smooth paint. Ben opened and closed the closet door as if testing whether it was real. Lillian stood still in the kitchen, looking at the stainless steel sink, the space where a real table would fit, and the cabinet still without marks of use. Samuel looked out at the yard and saw the place a hose could reach without effort, on a lot still bare, with exposed soil and construction debris. When they stepped outside, the realtor drew Samuel close to the car, away from the children. He spoke low and fast, like someone giving instructions for crossing a dangerous bridge without drawing attention. He said the bank in Decatur would require a larger down payment. He said it would be better not to talk too much with neighbors. He said the association was still organizing, but that outsiders could complicate things. Samuel nodded without arguing, because arguing there would be like raising dust on a dirt road. Everyone would see, and what was seen became talk, and talk became pressure. On the way back, passing Flat Shoals Road, Lillian looked at the trees and pastures and imagined Ruth walking to a less crowded school, Ben playing ball without an adult shouting from a porch. Samuel kept both hands on the wheel, but his thoughts moved back and forth between promise and danger, as if the road had two invisible lanes. Atlanta had changed since 1954, since the word integration began appearing in newspapers as something that could be forced forward or blocked with hatred. In 1957, they had talked on television about Central High and Little Rock. In Atlanta, conversations on park benches and in grocery lines came with a new caution, as if any sentence could become evidence against someone. Samuel was not a man of speeches. He was a man of schedules. But he understood pressure when he felt it. On the skin, in the throat, in the way a place could close doors without slamming them through credit rules, recommendations, and visits that were not visits. On April 8th, a Wednesday, he entered the small bank in Decatur on Church Street with his hat in his hand and the documents in a folder. The air conditioning was too strong, and the floor shone, with clean counters and hard waiting chairs. The young woman at the counter smiled without showing her teeth and asked him to wait. Behind a glass door, a man with slicked back hair and a dark tie read the papers, as if looking for flaws in fabric. He asked questions about Samuel's job, about Lillian's extra income, about the children's ages, about stability and length of service, as if every detail had to justify a greater risk. He did not ask directly about race, but race was in every second of silence, in every pause that stretched the room. When Samuel answered, he chose simple words, unhurried, as if each sentence had to be solid so it would not come apart right there. When he left, the April sun felt hotter than before, and the contrast with the cold inside the bank remained as a physical memory, a kind of warning stuck to the skin. The bank letter promise for the following week finally arrived on the 14th. Samuel read in silence, and the paper trembled slightly in his hand. The approval came with conditions: a larger down payment than they had planned, mandatory insurance, and a rate that felt like punishment for wanting too much, with monthly payments that would now compete with food, clothing, and transportation. Even so, it was a yes, and the yes carried the weight of a door opening and, at the same time, of a corridor narrowing. Lillian, hearing it, placed her hands on the edge of the table and closed her eyes as if holding water so it would not spill. Ruth smiled quickly, a smile that seemed to apologize for existing. Ben asked whether the new bedroom would have space for a toy train. On the morning of April 16th, Samuel went to the Western Union near the terminal and sent a short telegram to Mr. Henley confirming they accepted the conditions and wanted to close quickly, using the fast service that was still routine for formal messages. That same afternoon, an unfamiliar car drove slowly past the front of the rented house on Hunter Street, so slowly the engine seemed to breathe. It was a light-colored sedan with two men inside. It did not stop, but it passed two more times, as if memorizing the place, measuring the facade, the door, and the windows like someone learning a map without needing to get out of the car. The contract was signed on April 23rd, 1959, a Thursday. The office in Decatur smelled of paper and stamp ink, with stacked folders and standardized forms, everything arranged to look neutral. Samuel held the pen firmly, signed his full name, and Lillian signed just below. No one shook their hands with enthusiasm. Mr. Henley looked nervous, and the clerk did not raise his eyes much, as if the signature were just another entry. Still, when the key was placed in an envelope, the metal inside carried a weight that was not only material. It was the future. On the way back, in the back seat, Ruth held the envelope on her lap, as if it were fragile, as if it could break with a jolt. The move was set for Saturday, May 2nd. Samuel borrowed a truck from a co-worker, and Lillian wrapped dishes in Atlanta Daily World newspaper, tying them with twine, reusing paper and boxes as if each layer were protection against loss. On Friday night, May 1st, someone knocked at the door. 3 firm knocks, unhurried, as if they already knew they would be heard. Samuel opened it and found a middle-aged white woman, hair pinned up in a simple dress, holding a clipboard. Behind her, a tall man with crossed arms looked over her shoulder into the house. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Doyle, said she was from the Neighborhood Improvement Association and that she was visiting new homeowners to offer a welcome. The word welcome came out like something rehearsed, with the tone of someone taking attendance. She talked about trash, the right day to put it out, as if collection and curb appearance were part of code. She talked about lawns, proper height. She talked about quiet and security, as if they were items on a form. The man behind her said nothing. Then Mrs. Doyle asked, as if asking about paint color, how many people would be living in the house. She asked whether Samuel worked days or nights. She asked whether they would have a lot of visitors. Samuel answered politely, without opening space for conversation. Lillian stood behind him with her hand on Ben's shoulder, feeling the boy stiffen before he even understood. When Mrs. Doyle left, the man stepped forward and looked Samuel up and down. He said only one sentence, low, like a warning delivered without anger. Some things work better when everyone stays in the right place. And he left without waiting for an answer, as if the sentence did not require one. On Saturday, the sky dawned clear and the wind came from the south. The truck carried mattresses, boxes, a wooden wardrobe that creaked, and Lillian's sewing machine wrapped in a blanket. Samuel drove slowly along Moreland, feeling every pothole as if it were a test. When they turned into Cedar Grove Estates, the streets seemed too quiet, with houses still without curtains and new sidewalks. Their house, number 118, on Cedar Grove Drive, had a lawn still thin and a small oak planted near the curb. Lillian climbed down from the truck and stood for a moment, looking at the facade as if she needed to memorize it in order to believe it. Ruth ran up the steps, opened the door, and let out a breath that seemed to have been held since April. The first days had the rhythm of any move, boxes, nails, curtains improvised from sheets. Samuel went to the terminal on Monday, May 4th, and came back late, tired, but with the discreet smile of someone who had made it through a whole day without losing anything, hands marked by work and body on automatic. Lillian learned the new sounds of the house, the echo in the hallway, the hiss of the plumbing, the crack of settling wood. Ruth began walking to the school bus stop with a new folder, and Ben discovered the yard backed onto a patch of brush where he could find pieces of glass and old animal bones, remnants of land not yet fully cleared, as if the new neighborhood still carried something old and rough beneath the surface. On Tuesday, May 5th, a car stopped in front of the house in the late afternoon. Two white men got out wearing light t-shirts and work pants. One carried a toolbox. They knocked and said they were checking the water lines because of a problem on the block. Samuel asked for identification. One of them gave a short laugh and said they didn't need that it was just a favor. Samuel did not open. He kept the door closed with the chain latched and said any service would have to be scheduled with the developer. The men left slowly, looking at the windows as if taking notes, as if the refusal were just another data point. On the night of May 7th, a Thursday, the association held its first meeting on the vacant lot near the neighborhood entrance, where they had set up folding chairs and a table with a pitcher of lemonade. The news arrived in a note left in the mailbox. Homeowners meeting. Important matters. It was not an invitation. It was an order. Samuel went alone, in an ironed shirt, empty-handed. The sun was low, and mosquitoes were already appearing, drawn by standing water in ditches in the heat of day's end. About 20 people were there, almost all white, some with small children running around. When Samuel arrived, conversations stopped for a second and then resumed lower, as if volume itself were a kind of boundary. A man with a strong voice, Mr. Haskins, spoke about street lighting, about a request of the county for better paving, about maintaining the standard of the neighborhood, as if the standard were an asset to be defended in writing and through vigilance. He spoke of belonging, a word he repeated as if it were natural. Belonging as in belonging to a club, belonging as in having the right to say who enters. He said the association wanted harmony and values. No one mentioned color, but color was there like a pole that does not need to be pointed out to be seen. At one point, Mr. Haskins looked towards Samuel and said that some buyers had arrived without understanding the culture of the place. He said the association recommended that any future sale go through informal consultation with neighbors. Short laughs appeared here and there, like lids closing. Samuel stood until the end without speaking. When he returned home, the sky was already dark, and the neighborhood seemed longer, with uneven lighting and the distant sound of televisions behind walls. On the porch, Lillian waited with the living room light on, and her face held a question that did not need to be asked. Samuel told her everything in a few sentences, taking off his shoes slowly, as if noise might summon more visits. The following days brought the politics of belonging in small doses, like managed where a neighbor complaining about Samuel's truck being parked 5 minutes too long, a note about loud music on a day when there had been no music, an anonymous call that disconnected when Lillian answered, leaving only the dry click of the line. Ruth, walking to the bus stop, noticed two white girls from the street above pointing and whispering. Ben, in the yard, heard a man say from the other side of the fence, "Don't let the ball fall over here." Each detail seemed small enough to be denied and large enough to accumulate. On Saturday, May 16th, 1959, Samuel woke early to cut the grass with a borrowed mower. The smell of gasoline mixed with cut grass felt like a promise of normalcy, as if routine could be a shield. Lillian washed the kitchen floor and left the window open. Ruth read in the living room, and Ben played with a little car on the front step. It was nearly noon when a county police car stopped in front. A county officer got out, hat on his head, notepad in hand, with the posture of someone answering a call, and at the same time, someone who wanted to be seen answering it. He said there had been a complaint of a disturbance on the street. Samuel sweat on his neck, asked what disturbance. The man looked at the lawn, looked at the house, looked at Samuel's hands, and said it was a routine check. He asked for identification. Samuel handed it over. The officer wrote slowly, as if writing for someone who was not there, recording name and address with the calm of someone who knows the weight of a record. When the car drove away, the silence felt heavy. Lillian closed the window. Ruth did not go back to reading. Ben stopped playing and stared at the street as if it were an unknown animal, something that could come close without warning. The pressure, however, did not come only from outside. It also came from the bills. The larger down payment had eaten their savings. Lillian sewed late into the night, the lamp above the machine creating a circle of light in which the rest of the house seemed distant, with the motor's hum and the smell of machine oil. Samuel took overtime at the terminal when it was available, carrying boxes and pushing carts with aching hands. The new house demanded things: a decent curtain, a shelf, a repair to the faucet. Each purchase was measured like medicine, with receipts saved and bills lined up on the table. Because any mistake there was not just a mistake, it was an opening. In June, the heat arrived heavy. On June 9th, 1959, a Tuesday, Atlanta reached 94 degrees, and the air seemed still. Cedar Grove Estates had few large trees, and the sun beat directly on the roofs, as if there were nowhere to hide. Ruth began coming home from school with headaches. The school the county assigned her, near Gresham Road, was mostly white, and the bus dropped her at a stop where she had to walk 2 blocks alone, with asphalt radiating heat and little shade. She did not complain, but Lillian saw the way the girl took off her shoes slowly and went straight to her room, as if she needed to hide from her own body, as if the walk home were something she carried inside. On Sunday, June 14th, the family went to Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue, as they had before. The service had the same rhythm, the same pews, the same smell of wood and cheap perfume. There, for an hour, Cedar Grove felt far away, and the distance was almost physical. After the service, an older woman held Lillian's hand and said changes like that demanded a price, but that owning a home was something no one could take away easily. Lillian nodded, but the easily kept echoing, because ease was exactly what was missing, and what is not easy is usually what costs the most. On the night of June 22nd, a Monday, someone threw a stone at the side window of the house. The glass did not break, but it cracked into a web. The sound made Ben cry before he even understood. Samuel went out with a flashlight, walking across the lawn and into the brush behind, but he saw no one. The next day, he went to the county station to file a simple report. The officer looked at the form and said it was probably boys. He did not write much, and the paper ended up with only a few lines, as if the damage were too small to deserve attention, as if the crack were not also a warning. In July, the neighborhood held a community barbecue on a vacant lot. Charcoal smoke rose into the hot air. Samuel and Lillian received a note inviting them, and they decided to go because not going would be more dangerous than showing up. Absence could also be used as proof. Lillian brought a dish of fried chicken wrapped in cloth. Samuel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, smile restrained. The conversations around them happened as if they were new furniture in a room, noticed, commented on, but not included. Mrs. Doyle passed by and said, with sharpened sweetness, that it smelled wonderful. A white child pointed at Ben and asked loudly why he was so dark. The mother pulled the child by the arm and apologized without looking at Lillian. Ruth stayed near the drinks table, too quiet for a 12-year-old, holding her cup as if it were an anchor, as if any wrong movement might draw too much attention. On the way home, Samuel noticed the chicken had barely been touched. The dish came back almost full. Lillian washed the dishes in silence, and the running water sounded louder than it should have. striking the sink as if marking time, as if saying the day had ended, but the where had not. The catalyst came in a small, almost administrative form, like many things that change a life without seeming to. On August 3rd, 1959, a Monday, a letter was left in the mailbox with the association's letterhead. It said there were concerns about property values and that the association intended to propose to the county a set of recommendations to maintain the character of the neighborhood. At the end, there was a notice. An extraordinary meeting would be held on August 10th, and the presence of all homeowners was strongly requested. The letter did not mention the Carter family by name, but the papers seemed to point directly at their door, as if the letterhead were a finger, as if formality were a kind of threat. Samuel took the letter to work and showed it to an older co-worker, a man named Clarence, who had seen too much to speak loudly. Clarence read it and shook his head. He said associations like that knew how to apply pressure without dirtying their hands. He said the goal might be to make the family give up from exhaustion, from fear, from lack of air. Samuel folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket, as if he were putting away a nail, small but able to puncture. On the night of August 10th, Samuel went to the extraordinary meeting. It was in the garage of a house on the corner, with a fan making noise and doing little, pushing hot air and the smell of gasoline and wood. There were more people than at the first meeting, and a larger crowd did not bring welcome. It brought weight. Mr. Haskins spoke again, now with a map of the neighborhood on a table. He spoke of standards and mutual respect. At one point, a woman stood and said that some families were having too many relatives over, that it looked like a boarding house. Samuel knew it was a lie. Lillian's mother had come once, on a Sunday, and stayed only a few hours. A man said he had seen a group in front of the Carter's house, when it had only been Samuel and Ben washing the car, bucket and rag in hand, water running down the curb. The words were placed into the air as if they were facts, and the garage's hot air seemed to hold everything, not letting it dissipate. When Samuel stood up, the noise diminished. He spoke in a calm voice, without raising the volume, like someone describing a train schedule, because that was how he knew to keep control, through precision. He said the family had bought the house legally, paid on time, took care of the lawn, worked, and went to church, and did not accept invented accusations. He did not use big words. He did not speak of justice. He spoke of facts. The silence afterward was long enough to hurt. Mr. Haskins replied that no one was accusing anyone, that it was just a conversation about community. But his eyes, and the eyes of many others, held nothing of conversation, and the map on the table looked more like a boundary than a drawing. The following week, the unexpected visits increased, as if Samuel's response had triggered another stage. On Tuesday, August 18th, an unknown man appeared claiming to be an encyclopedia salesman. On Thursday, someone left a pamphlet at the door about family values and protecting the home. On Friday, August 21st, Ruth came back from the bus stop earlier and said the driver had passed straight by and only stopped after she ran and waved. She said it as if it were an accident, but her face was red with effort and humiliation, and her uniform clung to her body in the heat, as if the fabric itself recorded what had happened. The irreversible event happened on a hot night, September 5th, 1959, a Saturday when summer was beginning to ease but still clung to the skin. Samuel had taken an extra shift at the terminal and returned late. Lillian was in the living room sewing a light blue dress for a customer, the machine keeping its familiar rhythm, a sound that until then had meant work and sustenance. Ruth slept in the bedroom, and Ben had already been put to bed after asking for water twice. Around 11:40 p.m., a sharp crack came from outside, followed by a brief flash at the front window. It was not a large explosion, But it was enough fire to change everything because the fire did not need to be large to deliver what it came to say. A simple incendiary cocktail, bottle and rag, had been thrown against the porch. The glass shattered, the liquid spread, and it caught on the dry boards. Lillian called Samuel, and fear made her voice come out differently, as if the house had changed function in a second. Samuel ran to the door, saw flames licking the wood, and for an instant time seemed to lock on the image of fire reflected in the window, as if the outside wanted to come in. He grabbed the bucket kept near the sink, filled it with water, and threw it onto the fire. The water hissed, and the fire shrank, but did not go out at first. He threw more and more, until the smell of smoke mixed with the smell of fabric and machine oil, and the living room air turned rough in the throat, as if breathing had also become a task. Ben appeared in the hallway crying, his pajamas stuck to his body. Ruth came up behind him, eyes wide, silent. Lillian pulled the children into the kitchen, away from the front, as if the house had one safe side and one poisoned side. Samuel, hands trembling, managed to smother the remaining flames with a wet blanket. The porch was left marked, a black stain, eaten wood, and a burned corner of the railing. It was not only material damage. It was a message written in fire in a neighborhood where messages rarely came signed, and where the lack of a signature was part of the method. The police arrived after a call made from the kitchen phone, with Lillian gripping the receiver so hard her fingers turned white. A county car appeared within 20 minutes, lights turning without a siren. 2 officers walked across the porch, looked at the stain, and wrote something down. One asked whether the family had enemies. The question hung in the air like an insult, as if mere existence were a provocation, and as if the target had to justify the attack. Samuel said no. He said they had received visits and notes, but no names. The officer looked out at the dark street and said it would be hard to find anyone. He promised extra patrol for a few days. When they left, the tire marks on the asphalt looked like a line that led nowhere, a trace of passage without consequence. In the early hours, no one slept. Lillian sat in the kitchen chair with a blanket over her shoulders, staring at a cup of coffee as if it were something else, as if coffee could not perform its function. Samuel stayed in the living room without turning on all the lights, listening to every sound from the street. A cricket, a distant car, the crack of the house settling. Ruth sat on the bedroom floor with her back against the bed and held Ben's hand until the boy fell asleep from exhaustion, as if the body only shut down when it could not endure anymore. When the sun finally appeared, pale and without promise, the black mark on the porch was still there, clear as a sign, and the day began with what could not be undone. On September 7th, a Monday, Samuel missed work and went to the developer's office and then to the bank, asking about security, about the possibility of changing the financing, about anything that might ease things. The answers came in short sentences, as if the situation were an administrative inconvenience. The developer said he was very sorry, but the subdivision could not control behavior. The bank said the contract was the contract. The house was theirs with everything that meant, including the risk, and with the obligation to keep paying despite what happened on the street, as if the fire were a detail outside the paper. On September 9th, Lillian went to a small lumberyard near East Lake and bought boards to reinforce part of the porch, choosing common wood, measured and paid for carefully. Samuel and a co-worker from the terminal spent the following Saturday, September 12th, replacing burn boards, hammering nails with attention. The sound of the hammer was a kind of answer, not bravado, but survival, keeping the house standing because it was what they had, because giving up had a cost and staying did too. Ruth helped by painting the new section with leftover paint from the co-worker's job. Ben, forbidden to go near the tools, stayed in the yard kicking pebbles, watching the street at every passing car, as if the movement of vehicles had become a language. The association sent no condolences. Mrs. Doyle appeared once, on the afternoon of September 15th, walking slowly along the sidewalk, as if strolling and at the same time inspecting. She stopped near the porch and said it was a shame what had happened, that vandals were everywhere. She asked whether the family was thinking of installing a fence. She asked whether Samuel had considered speaking with the sheriff about private security. Then she said the neighborhood valued tranquility and walked away with light steps. Lillian watched until she turned the corner, as if she needed to see the end to confirm that, for now, it was only that. October brought cooler nights and leaves changing color on trees that were still few. The extra patrol that had been promised disappeared after a week. The fire did not return, but the politics of belonging adjusted. Now it came in silence and isolation, as if the threat could be maintained without noise. Ruth stopped going alone to the bus stop. Samuel began accompanying her when he could, and when he could not, Lillian went with her, even if it delayed sewing. Ben no longer played in front. He stayed in the backyard, where an improvised wire fence gave a false sense of boundary, and where the street seemed farther away, as if distance were protection. On November 1st, 1959, a Sunday, the family received a visit from Samuel's brother, Joseph, who lived in Summerhill. Joseph came in, saw the repaired porch, and did not need a long explanation. They sat in the living room with the radio low, playing news and music. Joseph spoke carefully about the possibility of selling and returning to a black neighborhood, where the threat would be different but not constant in that way, not infiltrated into every gesture. Samuel listened without interrupting. Lillian kept her hands in her lap, pressing the fabric of the dress she was sewing. Ruth in the hallway listened too, because in that house decisions traveled through walls. Samuel answered without anger. He said selling now would mean losing money, losing the little they had saved, and confirming to the neighborhood that fire worked. He said he did not want to raise the children learning they always had to retreat. At the same time, when he looked at Ben, he saw fear's mark in the way the boy held his little car, as if the toy were something he had to protect. The dilemma was not heroic. It was domestic, made of lost sleep and bills and safety, of decisions made at a table and not on a platform, of choices that came with neither applause nor a clean ending. Winter arrived mild, as it often does in the region, with cold days and clear skies. In December, on the 24th, Lillian hung a simple wreath on the door, made of cut green paper. Ruth helped wrap small presents, a blouse, a used book, a toy train for Ben that Samuel bought at a secondhand shop near Decatur Street. That night, the family stayed in the living room with the heater on, listening to the radio. Outside, the street was quiet. There were no knocks, no notes. The tranquility, even fragile, felt like a permitted interval, as if the calendar itself imposed a pause, and the pause was something to be used carefully. In January 1960, on the 11th, a Monday, Ruth came home from school with a paper stating that, due to a route adjustment, the bus stop would be moved farther away. It was bureaucracy, but it sounded like punishment because bureaucracy also knows how to push people into places where they're more exposed. Samuel went to the school transportation office in Decatur 2 days later, paper in hand. He waited in hard chairs, listened to people talking about delays and tires. When he was seen, he explained calmly that the change would leave Ruth walking alone through an area where there had already been hostility. The employee, without looking much, said the route was set for efficiency. Samuel insisted, citing the distance, citing safety. The man sighed and said he would make a note. He promised nothing. Still, 2 weeks later, the route was adjusted to stop 1 block closer. It was a small but real victory the kind that does not change the world, but changes the way home, and, with it, changes the body of a girl coming back from school. The porch scar remained visible, even with paint. The new would age differently, and the difference did not disappear. It only became part of what the house was. Lillian, when sweeping the front, passed the broom over that spot with an almost ritual care, as if the gesture were also a way to remember and control. Ben stopped waking up crying at night only in March, when the nights turned warm again. Ruth grew up a little faster than the year required. She began helping more in the kitchen, folding clothes, watching her brother as if he were her responsibility too, as if the house demanded vigilance in shifts, as if childhood had been shortened by necessity. In the spring of 1960, Cedar Grove Estates gained more occupied houses. Some new white families arrived without knowing details, and with them came small changes, almost imperceptible at first, but able to accumulate. A young woman, newly arrived from Macon, waved to Lillian one April morning. No fear on her face, only routine, waving because that is what one does. A boy from the house next door, who had not been part of the previous summer, tossed Ben's ball back over the fence without comment. It was not general acceptance. It was only a beginning of coexistence, slow, as if time wore down some of the hostility, as if it could also work in their favor. Samuel kept going to Terminal Station until, at the end of May 1960, he received a small promotion to a shift supervisor position. Nothing that would make news, but enough to reduce overtime a little. With that, he was home more in the late afternoons. He fixed the front door lock and installed a stronger light on the porch, widening the clear reach over the steps, as if expanding a field of vision. In early June, he planted a small magnolia near the young oak, digging into the soil with his hands and a short shovel. Lillian watched from the window, and the act of planting was understood as a practical decision, to make the yard the way it should be, as someone sets roots through work and not through speeches, as someone asserts permanence without needing to announce it. The association continued to exist, but the visits diminished, as if part of the objective had been achieved and part had failed. The Carter family had not left. They also had not been welcomed easily. They remained in a hard middle ground, a presence some neighbors preferred to ignore and others had to accept out of exhaustion, lack of alternatives, habit. The politics of belonging kept operating in details, looks that lasted too long, conversations that changed subject, invitations that never came. But the fire did not repeat, and the house began to stop being only a watched place and to become again, on many days, a used place, with ordinary tasks and ordinary fatigue, with the kind of normalcy that is not given, it is built. On May 2nd, 1960, exactly 1 year after the move, Lillian washed the curtains and hung them again, now truly bought in heavier fabric. The sun came through the cloth and left the living room in a pale tone, as if the light had found a surface that did not give way. Ruth, now 13, helped fold sheets and then sat at the table to finish a school composition, notebook open and handwriting careful, as if order on paper could organize the rest. Ben, 9, assembled the train tracks in the corner of the living room and called his father to see the full loop without derailing. Samuel came home from work, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and went down to the floor with the boy, adjusting a piece carefully, as he did with things at the terminal, because care was a language he knew well. Late that afternoon, the new neighbor from Macon crossed the street with a plate covered in aluminum foil and a simple line about having baked too many biscuits. Lillian received it at the door, thanked her, and did not need to explain any of the history to accept a gesture that was only that, food in hand and a short distance, an offer with no apparent condition. Ruth appeared behind her, curious, and the neighbor said her name and asked how the first month of school had been. Samuel listened from the porch, not smiling broadly, but with a face looser than the year before, as someone recognizing a possible normalcy, even if limited. That night, the family ate beans, cornbread, and greens, and then shared the biscuits while they were still warm. Lillian turned off the lights one by one, as she had done since the fire, checking the door, the chain, and the side window that had already been replaced, because routine could also be vigilance and, at the same time, rest. Ruth went to her room with her book and notebook. Ben put the train away in a shoebox, and Samuel was last in the living room, with the fan making the same sound as always. Cedar Grove Estates did not become a perfect place, but it became a possible place with payments made, with the porch repaired, with 2 trees gaining height and routine fitting again without effort on many days. And when the house finally fell silent, nothing seemed suspended or waiting for something else. It seemed only a family inside a home in September 1960, ending the day the way it had chosen. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video. It helps ensure that these quiet, often forgotten stories continue to be shared. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We also invite you to leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our viewers come from many places and generations, connected by a shared respect for history and the lives that lived it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.